The non-aligned movement holds its 15th summit in Egypt with a theme of international solidarity for peace and development. Born during the Cold War but outliving it, has the group also outlived its relevance? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Mariam Namazi. Egypt hosts the 15th Non-Aligned Movement Summit in Sharm el-Sheikh. The summit brings together foreign ministers and representatives from 118 member nations, including more than 50 heads of state. Tackling the global financial crisis and terrorism are top of the agenda. el-Sheikh reports.
Political realities have clearly changed since the times of the legendary pan-Arab leader, President Gamal Abdel Nasser. For one, most of the movement's members who are returning to Egypt for their 15th summit are no longer under colonization. On Wednesday, Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak is handed the chairmanship of the world's largest single political group from Cuba's Raúl Castro.
The
movement has confirmed its dedication that all the countries of the world have to be part of the search of an effective and just solutions in the actual economic crisis. As we say in Havana, the developing countries are the most affected from the global economic crisis. 100 million people in the world, particularly in our nations, are victims of illiteracy, unemployment, hunger, poverty, and curable illnesses.
Mubarak is just back from the G8 meeting in which he urged the leaders of the world's richest countries to freeze African debt. And it's this kind of world solidarity that the NAM summit is expected to emphasize, despite skepticism over the cartel's real powers and relevancy.
Now more than ever, your engagement is very vital to achieving global solutions to our common problems. The non-aligned movement's commitment to peace naturally led to its place a high value on a world free of weapons of mass destruction.
Some analysts insist that particularly these days, amid the global economic crisis, the non-aligned group, which has 118 member states, is more relevant than ever.
Let's forget about the name. The name is a legacy we inherited from that time. The new goals for the NAM is to liberate the member states from the what I call economic imperialism and political imperialism. So I believe that the NAM, especially during the last decade, has managed to tilt itself towards new goals.
Roles the world may be more open to now, as it witnesses a more welcoming political environment with the arrival of President Barack Obama to the White House. Many here believe that leaders meeting in Sharm el-Sheikh should capitalize on this so-called Obama factor, seize the moment, basically to push forward for practical measures to include their nations, both politically and economically, if they indeed still want to be seen as relevant. el-Sheikh for Inside Story, Sharm el-Sheikh.
Well, joining us now are our guests in Cairo, Gamal Abdel Gawad. He's a security analyst at the Al-Ahram Center for Political and Strategic Studies. In Vienna, Hans Koechler, he's president of International Progress Organization. And in London, Timothy Lynch, senior professor of US foreign policy at the University of London's Institute for the Study of the Americas. Mr. Gawad, if I can come to you first, has the non-aligned movement struggled to find a suitable role for itself since the collapse of the Soviet Union?
Yeah, definitely the end of the Cold War has taken the non-aligned movement into what can be described as an identity crisis. In fact, the world is no longer divided between two major blocs or two superpowers. There is no such a kind of ideological rivalry at the global level. This was the environment that the non-aligned movement served the best during the 1950s up to the 1970s or even the 80s. But now the non-aligned movement is in search of an identity, a new identity. And I believe this is one of the major challenges that the non-aligned movement is facing now, and this is one of the major issues on the agenda and on the current summit.
So you're saying the organization is largely pointless?
No, I wouldn't say that, because it is still it still has a function to serve. This is the largest forum representing the third world countries, and third world countries is the largest bloc in this world. It is a bloc that is for a great extent marginalized in terms of power, in terms of decision making and economic issues, etc. So to have this forum to address the concerns of the third world countries, and there is a lot of common concerns here, I think it does still have a function, but it still, however, needs to.
All right, well, let me put some of what you say then to Mr. Lynch. Mr. Lynch, as Mr. Gawad points out, 118 member states representing two-thirds of the members of the UN. This group represents a huge section of the world's population, doesn't it?
Well, of course it does numerically, but so what? I'm surprised you feel you can squeeze 30 minutes of informed discussion about NAM. It's clearly a more moribund, less efficacious. Well, I'm here to help as much as possible, though I will struggle. I mean, we already have the UN, and we know how ineffectual that can be, even though it represents supposedly every nation on the earth. How NAM expects to add value, in that old worn phrase, to what the UN does or doesn't do, I think is problematic. I mean, clearly what our initial guest is skirting is that rather than non-aligned, the non-aligned movement is clearly anti-American in its emphasis. It's the only thing that gives it any sort of coherence. Well, who wants to be in an anti-American world, which, as your intro piece has the first, truly third world produced American president?
Mr. Gawad, what's your response to that? In the context of today's world, the very name non-aligned is a misnomer, given the Cold War came to an end 2 decades ago.
I think it is, the name is a legacy that belongs to the past, but it does have important and positive connotation that should be maintained. However, the content should be changed, and now we see this kind of transformation happening to the non-aligned movement. In the past, there was a kind of a non-alignment ideology, and the ideology that was directed against, based on anti-imperialism, decolonization, etc. But now we see a greater concern on issues of economic development, on issues of economic equality and justice at the global level, in terms of redesigning global policies in issues of international trade, foreign direct investment, etc., to serve the needs of third world countries. So it is again a third world organization basically, but the mandate is gradually and in fact rapidly is changing from a high politics directed organization to an organization that its mandate is geared basically toward the issues of economic development.
Okay, so Mr. Koechler, let me bring you in at this point. Does the non-aligned movement play a role, however minimal, in building bridges across political differences, finding consensual positions on issues which are relevant to the member states?
I would say it should play a role. Unfortunately, there is a rather wide gap between the vision of non-alignment and the reality, the actual policies of the member states. But generally speaking, I think the idea of non-alignment is still highly relevant. We have now a unipolar constellation, not a bipolar one anymore, but in a unipolar constellation, there is one dominant superpower. And it is very important for smaller and medium countries to protect their independence and their independent possibilities of action vis-à-vis that great power center. So in a basic sense, they should be non-aligned. But of course, the reality is, although the colonies have disappeared, there are almost no more colonies now. But that doesn't mean that countries are not in certain forms of dependence upon particularly the major power in the world.
Well, let me put that point then to Mr. Gawad. I come back to this question of how non-aligned some of these countries are. For example, Egypt, Pakistan, India are all dependent on the US to an extent, or are at the very least US allies.
Well, again, non-alignment is the non-aligned movement is no longer about the foreign policy directions of this or that state. I mean, the ideology of non-alignment of the 1950s and 1960s is obsolete now and is no longer valid. The organization or the group is open for all third world countries, basically developing countries, regardless of their foreign policy orientation. The world is no longer that divided. Secondly, I think it is there is a very important symbolic meaning we can read in choosing Egypt to host the 15th summit and for Egypt to function as the leader of the group for the coming 3 years. This is a country that has strong relations with the United States, even though it is not an American ally. I mean, it is by the NATO standards, for example, definitely Egypt is not an ally to the United States, even though there is a lot of common interest and joint policies between the United States and Egypt. So there is a kind of a shift in the direction of the non-aligned ideology, movement, policies, etc., so that it is no longer an organization for the radical pro-Soviet socialist or so countries. There was a time when countries like Cuba, Algeria, even sometimes Iran played a major role in this organization. Well, let me put some of that then to Mr. Lynch.
Mr. Lynch, this summit also wants to focus on how the non-aligned movement as a group can develop. What, if any, options lie ahead for NAM?
Well, very few. I mean, absent a Cold War, what was anachronistic from its very beginnings in the 1960s looks decidedly moribund now. I mean, if your only position to retain any sort of internal legitimacy is to be anti-American, you'd have to query the whole point of the NAM exercise. Well, I'm sorry to appear cynical here, but my other guests seem to be skirting the issue. But the primary reason that NAM still has any relevance for those governments, and it's not really the people of those governments that send them to these forums, is to create some sort of internal legitimacy, to make people that rule Sudan and rule Cuba and rule Zimbabwe appear like statesmen. And I think in an increasingly globalized world in which we should recognize the rights of the individual, that entities like NAM, founded on the rule of strong men, and by and large most of the members are run by strong men, is beyond the pale, is not politically acceptable.
Mr. Gawad, do you agree with that assessment?
No, absolutely. Unfortunately, I don't agree with that. But it is here we're talking about a group of nations, the majority of the world community here. Those are the nations that most of them are marginalized in international politics. They are very vulnerable to the pressures coming from major powers and from other actors in the international community, from even multinational corporations and other. And they need some mechanism or some forum to show solidarity when it is needed, and this is one of the functions that the non-aligned movement is still serving in that regard. It is basically still at the diplomatic level.
In this debate, solidarity is merely a euphemism for anti-Americanism.
This is not necessarily this is not that.
Okay, hang on just a second. Mr. Koechler, you had something to say on that point.
Yeah, because now repeatedly the colleague from London stated that the only program, or claimed that the only program of the non-aligned movement is anti-Americanism. That's definitely not so. The reality is that we have one superpower now, and to try to define a policy that is non-aligned, that means independent of that superpower's influence, is not anti-Americanism, not in any way. I cannot subscribe to that. And I would say, in a situation like the present one, non-alignment is even more important than it was during the Cold War, when we had two powers and when smaller countries had more possibilities to take their decisions due to the rivalries between the two powers. Now they are at the mercy at the one big and all influential power center. So it is only fair that they try to make their point.
Yeah, let's look now at some of the issues on the agenda of the summit, Mr. Koechler, chief among them being the global economic downturn. Do you expect much agreement or consensus on this? Because, as Raul Castro pointed out, it's developing countries that are most affected by the economic crisis.
Indeed, yes. And what I would consider very important is that those member states of the non-aligned movement now are, or the leaders of those countries are courageous enough to define the interests, economic interests of their countries in an independent manner, and that they do not just follow the decisions that have been made in Washington and New York and London or wherever. That is that would be one of the main justifications for the existence, for the continued existence of the non-aligned movement. It is a big challenge now for all those countries, and they have to live up to it. And they have to show that they can make a difference also to the United Nations organization. In the UN, we have the big powers with special privileges, veto rights. In the Security Council, that means the smaller countries or the non-permanent members are almost marginalized. In the non-aligned movement, they could coordinate their policies freely, and they could raise their voice in a cohesive manner.
But there have been obstacles to coordinating their policies, haven't there? Mr. Gawad, ahead of the summit this week, the Indian government issued a challenge for the group to condemn terrorism without reservation, to stop justifying it. Now, this in itself highlights some deep divisions within the group, because there are, of course, 4 member states, being Iran, Syria, Sudan and Cuba, listed by the State Department as state sponsors of terror. So the group can't even agree on how terrorism should be defined.
Many of the issues that are dividing or controversial in the United Nations also known and make their way to the non-aligned movement summit. So it's not easy to reach a consensus on all issues, but at the same time, it is much easier and it is more likely to reach a consensus between the developing nations, because there is no concern over using this or that definition. Let us say, talking about a definition for terrorism, for example, to justify certain policies that would facilitate domination or hegemony on world affairs. It is policy differences between equal third world states, and there is a possibility that the differences here can be bridged. And I think this is a very serious challenge raised by India, and I believe that the non-aligned movement leaders will be able to reach a kind of a middle ground on such a kind of concern raised by India.
Mr. Lynch, I could see you nodding your head there. You do have here 118 countries with different economies, different political structures. It's unrealistic, isn't it, to think they can agree on everything?
Well, yes, of course it is, which is why I'm querying its utility. I mean, even for those, certainly for the people that their leaders are supposed to nominally represent, they would notice, I don't think, any difference in their standard of living, because their regimes are members of NAM. If you took 1960, 61, when the thing was formed, through to the present day, most of those nations have got poorer. Rather than richer. Those that have got richer, like India, did so very late by moving towards the United States rather than further away. So again, look, we're dealing with international relations here, and it seems to me the first goal of anybody that wants to play an IR game is how much influence or power do you have over the most powerful entity. And the NAM, I haven't done this check, but I think I'd be interested to know anybody that did, and see how many times candidate Barack Obama or even President Obama has actually mentioned NAM at all in any of his public rhetoric, let alone in his formal diplomacy. And I would say if that's your measure of success, then NAM has failed on almost every conceivable level.
Mr. Koechler, one issue that is expected to overshadow the summit itself are the talks on the sidelines of the summit between India and Pakistan in an attempt to resume peace talks that have been suspended. Whether or not the non-aligned movement is relevant, whether or not it successfully tackles the issues that are actually on the agenda, does it provide an arena, or at least a venue, for the world's leaders to meet on the sidelines? Can it be useful in that way?
Sure, in the form of, or as far as informal consultations are concerned, the non-aligned movement can provide a framework for discussions between leaders, and it can do so even in a better way than, for instance, the United Nations organization can, because in the United Nations organization you always have the great power and the superpower interests that may interfere. And I just would like to add or to comment on a terminology that has been used by the earlier speaker. the non-aligned movement is not a thing that has been created. It is a movement that was initiated at the end of the 50s. It doesn't have an bureaucratic organizational structure or a charter. It is a movement committed to certain goals. And this movement is definitely much more relevant now. And why should, just to respond to one more remark, why should the leaders of the non-aligned countries orient themselves completely according to statements or principles that have been expressed by the President of the United States, or according to lists of terrorist countries that have been established by the United States and its allies?
Well, Mr. Lynch, what's your response to that this is actually a legitimate movement committed to its own goals, that it actually has perhaps more relevance in a unipolar world as a way of representing the interests of developing countries?
No, I don't buy that for a second. I'm maybe even less convinced than I was 24 minutes ago. That this is clearly just a platform for leaders, many of whom aren't elected, to pretend that they have some sort of influence, that their ideological mission, which they use to justify their power, is in some way still relevant. Again, I'm asking you to look at the practical effects that NAM has had. I think it's almost to their credit that they are not bureaucratic in the way the UN is. They're fluid, they're a movement, they're poorly defined, they're not coherent, except in what they hate. They hate Israel and America. Contrast that with the UN, which is over bureaucratic, far more formalised in its structure, and in many ways is as useless as the NAM. In fact, what I think we should be debating is whether the UN still has relevance and practical.
Well, that would be a subject for a different show,
context.
Mr. Lynch, but we're running out of time. Mr. Gawad, just briefly, the NAM is also expected to call on US, Russia and the European Union to use their influence on Israel to honour its commitments to the peace process and to call to account those responsible for the deaths and damage during the war on Gaza. Now, that's all very well, but what can the member states actually do to pressure the Quartet countries to take a firm hand with Israel? What can they do in practical terms?
I believe that this summit in that regard is very important and is much more significant than any time in the past. The non-aligned movement used to issue declarations and statements criticizing Israel and calling for resolving the Palestinian issue, etc. But those kind of statements in the past fell on deaf ears in Israel, fell on deaf ears in the United States. But now it's different time. Israel, under this right-wing government, is highly isolated for a great extent. Its relation with the United States is somewhat tense. This administration in Washington is creating a distance between itself and Israel. So a statement made of that sort coming from Sharm el-Sheikh, from the non-aligned movement summit, perhaps will be much more effective than any similar statements came in the past because of the timing, because of the current
Okay, all right. Well, we're running
conditions.
out of time. Mr. Koechler, one quick final word from you. Looking ahead to 2012, what could Iran's chairmanship mean for the group? What sort of message does that send to Western countries and institutions at a time when Iran is facing increasing pressure over its nuclear program?
As far as I can see, it means that the member states of the non-aligned movements are sure of their position and they do not follow the priorities that have been set outside. Otherwise, they would not have dared to elect Iran for the chairmanship of the movement. As far as the nuclear issue is concerned, I think the member states will make clear also in the future that there can be no discrimination as far as the peaceful uses of nuclear energy are concerned.
Okay, well, Hans Koechler in Vienna.
Euro-liberal.
Okay, guys, well, thanks very much indeed for joining us. Hans Koechler in Vienna, Timothy Lynch in London, and Gamal Abdel Gawad in Cairo. And thank you so much for joining us here on this edition of Inside Story. We, of course, welcome your comments and suggestions. Email them to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. Bye for now.